Hello, friends of the internet, and welcome to our Martech webinar series on enterprise headless CMS. This one is called 3 Steps to Enterprise Grade Security and Authentication, and I am so pleased to have my friend James Q Quick join me, to help us go through this content. My name is Joel Varty. I'm President CTO at Agility CMS. James, first thing I got to say is congrats on your YouTube channel and the number of subscribers that you've got. This is incredible. Tell me about this a little bit.
Yeah, it's been a fun ride. I've been creating videos for almost 10 years now. Never really thought it was something I would take seriously until a couple of years ago and started doing it really consistently. And this past year, just had a couple of videos really take off. Actually, on the screen, there's the rap video that I did of kind of reflecting back on the road to 100,000 subscribers and trying to be realistic with people. Of like, there was a lot of time where there wasn't much visibility, not much money coming in from ads. But ultimately, after the course of several years and tons of videos, it started to add up.
Yeah, a lot of work, and I think it's a really testament to how much work and over how long a period of time that you've done this. And I'm just so happy you got great success. There's so much great content on James's channel, and we'll have a link to that down at the end for connecting with James. This is great. Let's dig into it. So first of all, I mean, pretty obvious question: why do we want to do authentication in CMS? So this is talking about the actual place where you're going to manage your content. Why would we want to authenticate to that? Which is it seems pretty obvious, right? Although in your conversations, James, do you talk to a lot of people who really don't understand what we mean by authentication, like right off the bat?
I think probably the difference between authentication and authorization is one that gets blurred and often overlooked. And so authentication is who you are. Authorization is then what you should have access to do. And I think that is the really crucial part of a lot of probably what we'll talk about today. I'm thinking about my onboarding experience. I just started a new role at PlanetScale, and they gave me access to the dashboard for where our blog content is. And I think they trust me, but probably the safer thing to do is to give me a very limited access to make sure that I can't go in and mess things up that I don't really understand yet, and then maybe grant me higher level of access later on. So yeah, I think authentication, authorization, those lines are not very clear to a lot of people, and then people kind of forget when they start building stuff that, hey, you probably want to have different levels of access for different people based on how long they've been there, what their role is, that sort of stuff, to really mitigate any accidents that might happen.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And then, from my point of view, when we talk about CMS, this is the content that's going to be on your websites or, in your apps or any digital properties where this content's going. So of course we want to authenticate a user and to be able to give them different levels of authorization within that. So let's dig into that a little bit, but what that means in terms of like enterprise authentication for your CMS. So these are the kind of high level topics we're going to go through today. First one is going to be editor SSO. So how can we do, by the way, SSO stands for, I believe it's single sign-on, right?
Yep, single sign-on. Yeah.
So how can we do, single sign-on for people who are actually working in the CMS, and that's for authentication. So we're going to use things like Azure AD or other tools to authenticate them based on a login that they've already got somewhere. So we'll talk about that quite a bit. We're going to dig into what I guess would be authorization within the CMS, so access control to different areas of content. And it's really nice how you kind of set that up for me, James, because I actually struggle with that myself and explaining it so clearly as you have. So that's great. And then the third thing is just, and we're going to spend most of the time on this one, just modern site development tactics with authentication authentication and authorization on top of that. So just strategies for working with like public content versus authorized content. So let's dig right into it. Right off the top, what kinds of SSO, so single sign-on connections, can we use to authenticate editors? And I've listed a few here, and I just want you to talk to me a little bit about this because you got a lot of experience with this, James, and just talk me through what these things mean.
Yeah. So first off is SAML, and then you've got the next bullet point is going to be OpenID Connect. And those are two modern protocols for doing authentication specifically. And the OpenID Connect have to be very specific there because OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 are two very commonly talked about workflows. OpenID Connect is specifically for or most specifically for authentication, and OAuth 2 is more specifically for authorization, giving an application access to do something on your behalf. So SAML is another protocol. I actually haven't done almost anything with SAML myself. All the stuff that I did with Auth0 was OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. But it's
Right.
another workflow where you build this kind of trusted relationship between some sort of identity provider and an application. So your application will basically tell you, hey, go over to this identity provider and prove yourself to them. And then they'll send something back to me, the application, for me to know that you were successfully logged in. And then you'll hear Active Directory, LDAP. I think you've got a couple more down here of Google Workspace and Azure AD. A
Yeah.
couple of different avenues that you can go for that identity provider, the thing that you trust to store the identity, the passwords, all that kind of stuff, and do that securely for you.
So the real benefit here is, correct me if I'm wrong, that so you've already, hey, I belong to an organization and we have some sort of identity management system that I log into. It could be that, hey, I'm already using like SharePoint and I log into my Office 365 account. We can use that same credential to authenticate into the CMS. And that kind of what you're describing?
Yeah, so there's kind of two different ways to look at it. There's one is you can have multiple applications have like a single source of truth for who the users are, and you may have to validate for each one of those applications against that identity provider. But SSO really gets into like after you've authenticated with one, and in your SSO provider, in your identity provider, you've configured a set of applications to be kind of connected to each other. After
Yeah.
you log into one, you're basically going to be considered to be logged in to the other ones that are in there. And this is going back to my onboarding at PlanetScale a couple of weeks ago. We've got a centralized dashboard in Okta that has a list of here's all the applications that you have access to. So after I log into one of those, I'm not prompted to log in again for the other ones. It already knows behind the scenes as it reaches out to the identity provider in Okta that I am validated and should be logged in.
Right. Cool. I mean, and I think the biggest thing is now, at the very least, I don't have to remember multiple passwords, right? So you have one thing. I think that's what it comes down to for a lot of people is like, I don't want to have to do all these passwords. But from an organizational standpoint, they kind of know and
Mhm.
trust who you are in those apps, right? And I think that's
Yep,
really what it comes down to. So that's great.
absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, so we've got the idea of enterprise single sign-on that we can do to authenticate to the CMS, which is really important for people that with sort of bigger organizations, bigger sites. But what's the difference between, you see a lot of sites that have like login with Google, login with Microsoft, and I consider those like social logins. What's the difference between that and enterprise single sign-on?
Yeah, so your enterprise single sign-on is you kind of mentioned this already. Typically going to be tied to like a workspace or a working group, like the company that you work for. So they might
Right.
have their list of users and they store them in any of the options that we just mentioned. And so often that's going to be associated with a work account of some sort. That means in your personal life, what do you do? Well, you potentially have lots of email and passwords and that kind of stuff. But what people started to do is almost hack what originally was OAuth 2 because it wasn't intended for people to use it to actually log in specifically. This is kind of an interesting story. But that's where the idea of OpenID Connect came from. And that allows you to log in with another application credentials into this one. And so a lot of that became really popular with social, just like you said, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Discord, Twitch, all the different ones that you could think of. And that
Yeah.
helps for kind of your average user outside of a company scenario to be able to log in with credentials that, without multiple credentials, log in with the same credentials across many different sites by connecting to that social identity provider.
You just use a lot of words to describe that. And I think that's awesome. One of the things that comes on top of that is, I think enterprise SSO, I really associate that with like trust in the identity provider. There's like a sort of trust relationship that the application and the organization have to create. And so I can trust that people who log in, only have access to that. One of the things that also gets talked about a lot is something called MFA on top of, maybe you have a username and password
Yeah.
or something, but you also have MFA. What is it when people talk about MFA? What does that mean?
Yeah, MFA stands for multi-factor authentication, and there's lots of different factors. People will have probably been through this themselves. You can register a phone number, and then they'll send you a text to your phone, and
Right.
then you'll go and enter that code. That code may come through an email. That code may come through an authenticator app. So there's this app that you can download on your phone You register it with that application, typically by scanning a barcode.
Right.
And then it kind of cycles through these tokens every 30 seconds or so. So you go to your phone, grab your device, grab that app, and then grab and copy that token. And all of that comes down to the concept of there's three ways to kind of prove who you are. I always it's simple, but I always stumble on this. So one is who you are, something that's like intrinsic to you. So something like a fingerprint or a retina scan or something like that. The other is something you have. So I physically have this device, and now I'm already stumbling. So something you have, something you are, and something. What's the third one?
Um, something,
Rats.
I don't know, some knowledge that you have, something you
Something you
know.
know. Yes, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there it
see,
is.
it's always easier than I make it out to be. So something you know, and the something you know gets overlooked in this case because that's just kind of like your regular password, or you might answer like a "What was your mother's maiden name?" type
Right.
question, that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
multi-factor authentication is combining multiple of those factors. So most commonly, again, is password, something you know, and then you're adding on either something you have, like I have access to this device, or something
Right.
that's intrinsic to me, and we're seeing it more, especially on laptops, where we've got fingerprint scanners, buttons
Mhm.
on these laptops where you can, instead of typing in your password, you can just use your fingerprint scanner and get access to whatever it is that you're trying to do.
Right. Yeah, and what's really interesting with enterprise single sign-on, I get this question a lot with regards to, with our customers coming onto the platform thinking, well, do we have to turn on MFA now? That should already be on in time inside your enterprise SSO. If you're using something like, Active Directory or whatever, you will use the multi-factor authentication that your organization sets up for you, and then you don't have to do another multi-factor to get
Mhm.
into a thing, something like Agility CMS or any other apps because you're already identified, you're
Yep.
already authenticated. So that kind of takes away that. Yeah, MFA it's a lot. It can be a lot. Let's dig into a little bit around authorization. And this is actually kind of the easy one, but it comes down to one of the things that James was just talking about is oftentimes as a as an organization, it's a lot easier to just give people global access. Here you go. You have access to do what you want. You're an employee of the organization. We trust that you're going to be smart. And here you go. You got admin access to everything. And it's amazing how many times when I go through with a customer to look at their CMS setup, how many times everyone has access to everything. And it's an interesting thing because it makes you feel trusted, but also it's like maybe that wasn't the smartest thing to do, just like you're talking about, James, right? And so it's one of those things where I think you need to think about it and then just do the right thing. But it's not a set it and forget it, right? Like it could be, James, that now someone could reconsider, right? They can go back and rescind some access and fix that, right?
Yeah, and I've been in situations going both ways, being granted more access and being taken away access in my career as a developer, thinking about like managing databases and pushing
Yeah,
applications to production and stuff like that. Where hey, as a junior dev, we may not give access directly to production server, right? We want to make sure that we're like teaching and helping people grow and understand what the impact is.
right.
And then after a few years, now maybe that person leads a project and they're going to have admin access to do whatever they need to do. The flip side of that is someone has access to something they really shouldn't have, and they accidentally make a mistake. It's not necessarily their fault, but they make a mistake and change something that they shouldn't have. That's a reason for us to now look at our level of granularity and be more specific to restrict who has access to what.
Yeah. So certainly important to look at, hey, you can grant global access to things and agility has the ability to do that. And in some cases, that's the right thing to do. In some cases, it may be something you want to consider. But certainly, I think the reason people do it is they just want to get things done. And so hey, just get it done. Here you have access and now you can go, which can be a bit of a double-edged sword.
Mhm. Yep.
So we can give page level access in Agility. So you can have access to one page on the sitemap and all the things that has under it, including sub pages potentially. So that's one way to control authorization. And then we can do content level authorization where you can have only access to one list of content or maybe even a single item of content to really get it very granular. And then there's all kinds of approval processes that you can put on top of that. And I think it's interesting. I don't know, James, have you ever been, I have to say, I both love and hate approval processes with regards to authorization for getting me to be able to do stuff. And I think part of it as a developer, it's horrible to think that, oh my gosh, I have this code that I think is great and it belongs on production. I can't wait to see it live, but then I have to wait for it to go through the DevOps and chains and approvals and stuff. It's the same thing with content. What's your experience with that, James?
Yeah, I've definitely I've been in having worked at All Zero doing a ton of content, having done guest author blog posts and things like that. It can definitely be frustrating to go through a really long process of review for content to go live, especially when you consider yourself to be a pretty competent content creator. So sometimes that sort of stuff is tough. And I've made decisions in the past to just put stuff on my own blog or YouTube channel because it was easier because I could just get it out there. But I think the thing to consider, obviously, for companies is they have to be very careful about what goes out there and they have to really make sure that there's no mistakes. So there's nothing accidentally inappropriate or incorrect or something like that. So I think having that level of control grows with the size of the company and the exposure that that company has, and
Sure.
especially depending on the content. Like when we did content at All Zero, that is authentication, like OAuth 2 and OpenID, like specification related. That sort of stuff really has to be top notch because people look at All Zero
Mhm.
as a leader in that realm, and if you put something out there that's incorrect, it's not a good look. So I think it's totally understandable that not only the bigger you get, but depending on the content, you definitely want to have more control and eyes on the things that you end up publishing.
Right, right. Yeah, that's a great point. So if we look at, how granular should we go for access control within something like a CMS, it could come down to accountability and how can we be, provide accountability for the content that we're creating and putting out there on the internet. Especially with something like a CMS that allows you to go omni-channel with something. I push it out and it could be going to smart TVs and mobile apps and websites, and we have to be accountable for that content. So that's a great point. Thanks, James. Okay. So now we get really into the meat of this, and this is really something that's, as you know, I'm a technical person, and I think this is one of the things where modern development has changed a lot with regards to how we build applications. And I know, James, you've been putting in a lot of content lately about how authentication and authorization kind of works within these new modern development stacks that we have.
Yeah. So I'll throw out the first buzzword, which is the Jam stack, and the JAM stands for JavaScript APIs and markup. Markup is Markdown or HTML or whatever it is you want to use for that. And Jamstack, the word, the idea is really kind of taking the web development ecosystem by storm, but inherently it's not really much new stuff, right? JavaScript we've been using for years,
Yeah.
APIs to get data and save data we've used for years, markup we've used for years. Jamstack has really just changed the way that we think about combining those things that we're already used to. And I always say, like, it starts with, and it may be a good time to do the next slide, but it starts with a focus on static content. And
Right.
my
Right.
definition of static content is it's a set of files that you can host as is on a CDN. So the interesting thing about that is your favorite frameworks, React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, those can be hosted as static assets because they go through a build process and get hosted anywhere with a CDN. So that actually is considered static, even for me, even though it's not a static experience.
Right.
But then you can take that a step further and have like actual statically generated content where you may go to a headless CMS at a build time for your application, grab all the blog posts or whatever data types, and then go ahead and pre-render all of those individual pages and then ship those directly so that they're faster, they're more secure because there's not a server going on behind the scenes, and all these benefits that people talk about in the Jamstack. The next really interesting thing, though, is we've really come full circle. If we look at what Ruby on Rails was with the kind of the default way to build applications and Node and Express as a backend doing server side rendered applications, we moved away from that at kind of the beginning of the Jamstack to really focus hard on static content. And then people
Yeah.
realized we should be able to use this to do more in a modern way. And so we've gone full circle to now incorporate API routes is typically the way people refer to these that are hosted as serverless functions. So now we're not having to deploy full servers. We're not having to maintain full servers. We have the ability to run code on the server that's built into a framework, but we can actually mix the static rendering and the server side rendering. And so you get the best of both worlds, which then means you have a few different ways to do authentication here. So the first one was static rendering. A lot of what people may not get is most static site generators, or a lot of them, even though it's a static page, it still ships with that framework, React, Angular, Vue, etc. And that means that you can do this rehydration process where you can run JavaScript on the client just like you would with regular React Angular Vue. So what in there, as you got in here, you might have a loading state while you're going to figure out if the user is authenticated. Then you decide based on if the user is authenticated, which data to show. You then may load the client, load that the user is logged in, then show a loading state for their data while you go and query the database or an API to get that data. So all of that stuff is taking place on the front end and the client side JavaScript. The opposite of this in server side rendering is you do all of that stuff on the server before you actually ship that page to the user. So you go and say, hey, is there a cookie associated with this user? Okay, cool. That user is considered logged in. Now let's go ahead and get their to do items or blog articles or whatever it is, and then pass that to the page that then renders it. So you don't have to worry about this client side loading. So it's
Right.
really interesting how we came full
Yeah.
circle, but now we have kind of the best of all worlds really to be able to combine these things.
So let's take a look at that. So I'm gonna go back a second to the static rendered one, just to sort of get a frame of reference for where I would consider like the start of what I would consider modern development, right?
Mhm.
So a static rendered page is basically, as you say, it's an HTML page, but it's going to load that React app, right? Or Svelte or Vue or whatever it is. But then it, as you say, it rehydrates. So I'm just in terms of like CMS content now. So say we had like a blog post. A good example here is a blog post with comments, although I hate
Yep.
blogs with comments, but you know, or if I wanted to like have a product rating or load a price even, that's based on, where the user is, if they're coming from the UK, something like that. We know that from what they've said as their logged in preference, something like that, some kind of personalized content. So the static stuff comes from probably from the CMS, right? Well, that's where that pre-rendering process comes from. And then explain to me the rehydration point where we're going to go fetch data. Like just break that down a little bit. And is that what I would consider? Like sometimes you get like a flash of content that's not quite there yet. And what's a good strategy for dealing with that?
Yeah. Yeah, the blog and comments is absolutely the perfect example of this. So if you think about your blog post, like even if you're really active, you're maybe writing a blog post a day. That would be a very active blog. And so in the static content, that means you're doing a build of your website each day because you want to grab that latest post and then have
Mhm.
that be displayed in your website. But things like comments, you could have a million comments on a blog post. You never know how many or when they're going to come in, so you can't really count on any regularity. You don't really know when those new comments are there. So what you do is, as you said, you grab that blog post as an example. At build time of your application, it generates an HTML page that already has all the blog content in it. At the bottom of that, you probably have some sort of placeholder for a comment section. And when that HTML gets shipped, it ships along with JavaScript, probably of your favorite framework. And that framework now can make a fetch request on the client to say, hey, go and give me all the comments associated with this blog post. So now you're mixing this static content along with just real client side regular JavaScript that we've already been knowing and loving with single page applications. And we can
Right.
add on different pieces. The benefit, or one of the benefits of this, is SEO for that static content, because even though you have this ability to add extra things with client side JavaScript, that core HTML page already has the things that Google is looking for. Google is probably not indexing by the comments on your blog post. Maybe there's some searchability there. More importantly, it's going to index based on the title and the subtitle and metadata about the post itself.
Right.
So you get the benefits of static content in terms of SEO and speed, and then you get the ability to layer on top of that with client side JavaScript.
Yeah, so on all of those blog sites where it says, "Hey, log in to view comments" or "log in to
Mhm.
comment," that's just what you described there. Okay, that's awesome. And now if we switch to the server rendered or like the Back to the Future model, as we could call it, where it's similar but different to how it was before. Talk us through how it's different. How is the new server rendered different from when we used to do it with like a PHP or a Java app?
In a lot of ways, it's not so different. The I think the big difference is how traditionally we're hosting these. So in a framework
Right.
like Next.js, they have page-based routing or
Mhm.
file-based routing. So you create a file in a certain directory. If you create it in your pages directory, that becomes a page. If you create it in an API directory, that thing gets hosted as an API endpoint. So we now have these kind of serverless functions that can do server side logic for us. And then we have the ability on a page route to tap into logic on the server before we actually render that page. How we would do this with PHP and Ruby on Rails, it's basically the same concept of on the server, a request comes in, we go and grab user information, information associated with the user, like their blog post, use that to then spit out this HTML template of some sort, and then send that back to the user. But going back to things we've already talked about, is a lot of these frameworks then give you still the ability to do that client side JavaScript. So you get the server side rendering for speed and not having loading states that you talked about with the client.
Right.
Ship all that to the browser, and you can still layer on stuff with client side JavaScript if you want to.
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the use case. So I'm gonna go to the e-commerce use case for this one because this is one that comes directly to mind.
Mhm.
So I'm logged in to my e-commerce to an e-commerce website, and I'm shopping through, and maybe I'm from Canada, and so even though the site might have statically rendered those sites with like US dollars, it sees that I'm coming from Canada and renders it for me specifically with Canadian dollars and a different price for those items. Is that an interesting use case? Does that make sense for what you're talking about for server rendered?
Definitely could. Yeah. So you thinking about that request that's coming in for that page, you can inspect the different properties that come in that request. One of which might be their language preference or country of origin or something like that. And
Right.
then you have the ability to determine what sort of content you want to return based on that. So there's lots of different factors that you could take in and then customize that data going back to the user to be as appropriate for them as possible.
Right. And so I wouldn't see a flash of content where it's like, hey, it's coming from the wrong thing, and then it flashes to the right thing. We can make it so it just instantly loads the right thing. Now, one of the things that I've heard about is something called edge rendering, and you kind of talked a little bit about serverless and that kind of thing. How does, and I didn't do a number three for this because I think it's kind of getting a little advanced, but I did want to mention it because it does come up in questions, even when I'm not talking to developers, just talking to sort of people at the who are just asking me, hey, what's edge rendering? Well, I want to host it on the edge. How do I do that? How does that fit into this model?
Yeah, this is. I had to go down some clarifications of what the edge actually meant recently myself. So if you think about a server-side rendered application, that application is hosted in a data center somewhere in the East United States, in Australia, and Japan, in a data center somewhere. So let's say it's hosted in the U.S. and East Coast of U.S. and Virginia, and then someone tries to access, get a page from that site from Japan. Well, it has to make that request all the way across the world to Virginia, and then it responds back. So there's this time that it takes to actually travel that far. So the edge is now putting these kind of middleware, and Next.js has talked about this in their latest release, but putting these middleware pieces now replicated across data centers across the world. So they can almost kind of intercept your request and do things first before sending your request all the way over to the original data center in Virginia. So this means
Right.
now that if someone is in Japan and they want to access a site that is the server is hosted in Virginia, and we want to basically redirect, let's say, a user if they're not logged in. So before the edge, they'd have to make the request all the way over to Virginia. Then they would get the response, which would redirect them to a login page. Now, though, with the edge, it kind of intercepts that request, and it will intercept it in a way that's closer to the user. So if they're in Japan, there's probably a data center in Japan or in that part of the world. And having that middleware closer to them means they can now figure out that there's a redirect to a login page that much faster. And then that request never even makes it all the way to Virginia because it's saying, hey, we don't need to talk to the main backend server. We can handle
Right.
this right here and go ahead and redirect the user to a login page.
Right. So this is an even smarter pattern of adding, we've got server rendered, but we've kind of got edge rendered on top of that to be even smarter when we don't need to go back to the
Mhm.
server, which is like the origin here. So there's even more advanced stuff that we can doing. And you mentioned Next.js. I think that's in Next.js 12, which was, almost is pretty brand new, right? Has that been
Mhm.
released yet, or is it still kind of beta?
Yeah, it's been as far as I know, it was I think it was released that day. I think it wasn't. I guess I shouldn't get ahead of myself. I'm pretty sure it was launched officially that day when they did that
Cool.
big conference and announcement.
That's awesome. So there's whole lot of sort of methodologies for attacking this kind of authentication within your site, and how to handle, all the different loading states and all the different ways of sort of blending static and server render content with these modern frameworks. That's awesome. You do such a great job explaining these things, James. Thanks for doing that. So,
Yeah.
what approach? Just this is probably one of the hardest questions. Like, what do you recommend? What do you think people should be looking at when they're sort of thinking of, okay, I have this new website, or I'm going to take my existing website and build it again. We're going to get our content ahead of the CMS. We're going to use these modern tools for authentication and for developing the website. What's the stack and approach do you recommend?
Yeah. I think very generically, starting as static as possible is probably good advice. If you're just doing blog posts and you don't have comments, there's not really any reason for you to have server interactions.
Right.
One additional thing that we haven't mentioned is incremental static regeneration, and I think that has a few different names. One of
Hmm.
the downsides of having a completely statically generated site is you only get updated information displayed on your site when you go through another build. So it means I had a new blog post in my headless CMS. I then have to go and build my website. But you can set up incremental static regeneration to incrementally go
Yep.
and actually grab the latest data from a database and maybe not even have to build all of it up front. If I have a million blog posts and people only view 100 of them, I don't need to
Yep.
build a million. I can build
Yep.
100 and then build them as they come in. So that's another tool that people have access to.
Right.
But I would start with as much static content as you can get. And then when it gets into authentication, I personally like working with server side rendered methodologies so that I can make a completely informed decision of what content I'm sending back to the browser based on the user being authenticated or not. I think it kind of simplifies the loading state process of
Yep.
thinking about loading data. I've got a loader for is the user logged in? Then I've got a loader for the data itself versus server side rendered. That stuff is just going to be there by the time it gets to the browser because it's already done those calculations. So when authentication comes into play here, I actually really like tying this into doing that on the server and server side rendering. But at the end of the day, again, with modern frameworks, you can combine these to do different pieces in different pages or different API
Yeah.
routes or whatever you want to do. You can combine them in the way that works for you.
Right. So we can render a chunk of it in static and do server rendering for other things, and kind of
Mhm.
mix and match as we need. That's awesome. So we can get the best of both worlds even within the same app. That's
Absolutely.
great. This has been awesome, James. Really appreciate talking about this. Here's a few of the tools that I did from a very quick web search. Auth0, you're very familiar with, James. But other ones is Supabase. Netlify has its own identity platform that they've come up with. A lot of folks are using Firebase. There's another one out there called Magic, works like magic, to connect. Any other tools off the top of your head, James, that you think are sort of things that people should be, playing around with and trying out?
But next auth is it's a package
Right.
that does it's kind of an abstraction layer against auth. So you still have to have your own database. You still have to configure your email provider to send out emails and stuff. But
Mhm.
that's a really popular one. I'm actually a really big fan of Supabase. Their product has been really incredible, and they've shipped lots of updates, and they've gotten funding, and they just seem to do really well with developer experience. So I've been a big fan of theirs. I'm keeping my eye out on them. I just recorded a podcast episode on things that we're excited about for 2022, and that
Right.
was one of the ones that I'm really excited about. And then yeah, Auth0 is I loved working at Auth0 when I could very comfortably say, like, if I were to add Auth, this is absolutely
Yeah.
one of the top options that I would go to work with, especially in the React ecosystem. I think they really nailed the integration there. But yeah, lots of really good options out there.
Right. So when you're kind of mixing and matching your toolkit, these are a few that you can look at, and certainly, would love to have more conversations with all of you about these different options for sure. That's great. One of the things I want you guys to do is follow James. So he's on Twitter at James Q Quick. He's on YouTube. He's all over YouTube. So just subscribe to there, James Q Quick. I know I subscribe and I love watching the content. And you can see his website, jamesqquick.com. Of course, I'd love to continue the conversation with all of y'all. So you can follow me at Joe Varty on Twitter or Agility at AgilityCMS. Lots more webinars to come, and you can view previously recorded ones, agilitysms.com/events. And you know what? Just send me an email and we'll chat. Joel at agilitysms.com. James, it's been great having you on this. And thank you all for coming. This has been fabulous.